So this is the last topic in Unit 4. This is half-angle identities. How we're going to do this is today we're going to work on the sine and cosine identities, and then tomorrow we'll do the tangent identities. This topic is very similar to the sum and difference that we've already done last week. And like last week, we're going to divide it up. Right? And the reason it's similar is because in the formula, the x value is a angle on the unit circle, and what we're given is half of an angle. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take our number 7 pi over 12 and multiply it by 2, all right, which gives us 7 pi over 6, and this gives us the angle on the unit circle that we can put into our formula. Okay. So again, it's a lot like the sum and difference in that we're given a radian that's not on the unit circle. We want to find one that is. Okay, and then we use this formula to find out what the numerical representation of that angle is going to be, or that radian is going to be. Okay, so how this works is you're going to multiply your value by 2, like we just shown you. So 7 pi over 12 times 2 gives you 7 pi over 6. Then we're going to put that value into our formula. Okay, so we have the square root. Let's make this big. The square root of 1 minus cosine times 7 pi over 6 divided by 2. All right, now there's a plus or minus in front of it. That's going to be an important piece that we're going to look at later. Okay, and when we talk about the end of this problem, we'll explain what the plus or minus is for and how we use it. Okay, so now what we got to do is simplify the cosine of 7 pi over 6. So we're going to have 1 minus the cosine of 7 pi over 6 is going to be negative root 3 over 2. All right, divided by 2 with a big square root on it. So all we did is we take the cosine of 7 pi over 6 and made it into a number from the unit circle. Okay. Now in the numerator of our big fraction, we have these two numbers. We have 1 and then root 3 over 2. So we have to combine those, and we do that by getting a common denominator. Sorry, I forgot the plus or minus. Okay, so the common denominator is going to be 2. So this fraction is going to look like 2 over 2. And since there's two negatives, it's going to be a positive. And then root 3 over 2. Okay, so when we put that down, we combine those two things, you're going to get 2 plus root 3 divided by 2, and then divided by 2 again. Okay, with a big square root. All right, now what we have is a complex fraction. Okay, we've dealt with complex fractions before. The 2 on our denominator is really 2 over 1, so we're going to multiply it by its reciprocal, 1 over 2. All right, that whole thing will cancel out. You have 2 plus root 3 times 1, which is just 2 plus root 3. And on the bottom, you have 2 times 2, which is 4. And we have a big square root on top of it. Okay. So then what we're going to do is we have a square root on the top and a square root on the bottom. Well, the square root of 4 you can actually do. So you have 2 plus root 3 square rooted. And on the bottom, you get just the square root of 4, which is 2. Okay. And now the plus or minus comes into play. Okay. So we want to know if this value is going to be positive or negative. Okay, so we're dealing with sine. Okay, so if we talk about this, we're looking at the unit circle in a sense where we have 7 pi over 6, which is right here. Okay, and let's look at it in terms of degrees. So 7 pi over 6 is 210 degrees. So 7 pi over 12 is half of that. So what's half of 212? Or sorry, 210? It is 105. So 7 pi over 12 is right there. So if we're thinking about the unit circle, in this quadrant, is the sine value a positive or a negative? Remember, sine is y. And in that quadrant, y values are positive. So this would be a positive number. Okay, it's not a negative, so we just put the positive. And that's your answer. That's it. You're done. Okay. Let's look at the next one. So cosine. So we're going to have 5 pi over 12. We're going to multiply it by 2, which gives us 5 pi over 6. Okay, so we're going to put this into the cosine formula. So it's going to be 1 plus the cosine of 5 pi over 6 divided by 2 with a big square root on top of it, and a plus or minus in front of it. Okay, now we figure out what the cosine of 5 pi over 6 is. If we look at our unit circle, the cosine of 5 pi over 6 is negative root 3 over 2, all divided by 2, with a big square root on the whole thing, with a plus or minus in front of it. Now, like before, we have to combine this fraction on the top. Okay, if you saw the way we did it before, the common denominator is going to be 2, so this 1 that we have is going to be 2 over 2. So I'm going to kind of skip a step in a sense. I'm going to put 2 minus root 3 over 2, all divided by 2. All right. Again, we have a complex fraction, so this 2 over 1 becomes 1 over 2. Gets multiplied to the top. All those cancel. We're left with 2 minus root 3 all over 4 and a big square root. All right, and then finally here we have the square root of 4 just becomes 2. So we have the square root of 2 minus root 3 over 2. And just like before, we have to look at the unit circle. So here's our unit circle. We're looking at 5 pi over 12, so that's going to be 5 pi over 6, which is what we're going to base everything off of. 5 pi over 6 is right here. And that is 150 degrees. So half of 150 is going to be 75. 75 degrees is going to be right here. So this is 5 pi over 12. So in this case, we're looking at cosine, and cosine in the first quadrant is either positive or negative. Okay, in this case, cosine in the first quadrant, the x terms in the first quadrant are positive, so we put a positive sign in front of it, and then we are done. Okay, if cosine had been in the second quadrant, all right, then it would be negative, and then we'd have a different answer. Okay, it'd be a negative number instead of a positive. Okay, let's try another one. We have 11 pi over 12, so we take 11 pi over 12, multiply it by 2, get 11 pi over 6. Okay, since it's cosine, again, we use the same formula we just did. So we have 1 plus cosine of 11 pi over 6 divided by 2 with a big square root on top of it. Okay, next we find out what the cosine of 11 pi over 6 is. So if we look at a unit circle, 11 pi over 6 is going to be root 3 over 2. Divided by 2 with a big square root and a plus or minus sign. Okay, again, we have this fraction on the top. So we're going to combine the two numbers. You're going to get 2 plus root 3 divided by 2, all divided by 2 again, and plus or minus in front of it. Okay, now like before, we have this complex fraction, so we're going to multiply by its reciprocal, so it's going to be 1 over 2. These all get canceled out, so we're left with 2 plus root 3 over 4 with a big square root, and a plus or minus. All right, we break up the square roots and square root what we can. So we have 2 plus root 3, all being square rooted. The square root of 4 is 2. And again, now we look at the unit circle. So here's our unit circle. 11 pi over 6 is going to be over here at 11 pi over 6, which is the same thing as 330. Okay, if we're doing 330 and we divide that by 2, let's check out what that is. That is 165. So 165 is going to be over here. So this is 11 pi over 12, which is 165. Okay, so now we are dealing with a cosine function. So in this quadrant number 2, what are the x values? The x values are negative, so this is going to be a negative number. And we're done. Okay, last one. It's slightly different because now we have a different kind of radian. We have 7 pi over 8. So 7 pi over 8 times 2 is going to give you 7 pi over 4. So we put this into the formula for the sine half angles. So that is going to be 1 minus cosine of 7 pi over 4 divided by 2, square root sign with a plus or minus out in front. Now we look at 7 pi over 4, and what that is for cosine on the unit circle, that is positive root 2 over 2. So we have 1 minus root 2 over 2. Okay, the minus sign, although the cosine of 7 pi over 4 is positive, the formula has a negative, so it's still going to be a negative. Divided by 2, so the plus or minus and the square root on the whole thing. All right, although the number is different this time, it's not square root of 3 over 2, it's square root of 2 over 2, the process is still the same. We're combining the fractions with a common denominator. So we're going to get 2 minus root 2 over 2 divided by 2 with a big square root and a plus or minus. Once again, we're going to multiply by the reciprocal of our complex fractions denominator. So we multiply by 1/2. All that will cancel. We'll have 2 minus root 2 over 4 under big square root with a plus or minus. Then we square root the bottom of our fraction, our denominator, which gives you 2 minus root 2 with a big square root. But this time the bottom is now the square root of 4, which is just 2. Okay, now again, we look at our unit circle. So our value that we're using was 7 pi over 4. So 7 pi over 4 is right here at 315 degrees. So if we do 315 and divide it by 2, you're going to get 175.5. So it's going to be somewhere around here. So 7 pi over 8. Okay. So we want to figure out in this quadrant what is the sine function. So in that quadrant, the y values are going to be positive. So we're going to leave it as a plus. And there you go. And that is the sine and cosine half angle formulas. So that's all we got for today. Tomorrow we'll look at the tan ones and then give you a short formative or practice sheet. And then we'll start looking at the test ahead. And we'll talk to you tomorrow.